Hello and welcome to Storytime with Scott Boss. We're going to start reading the Graveyard Gazette. Prologue. 40. It was the age Carrie Mathis had been afraid of since he was 10, then 20, then 30. The fears varied in size and importance over the years, but his main concern was constant throughout his life. 40 was when the pendulum swung to old. There may have even been a loud dong that resounded during the wee hours of the morning when 39 officially died and 40 was delivered to his world. But Carrie didn't hear it. He was too busy sleeping, trying to pretend it was just 30 showing up again. 30, when you were still cool as long as you were married, had a house, car, a decent paying job, and mainly you were not old yet. But it was not 30. He found out, as everyone does, that 30 only comes around once. 40 was like the Monday of ages, and if that were true, he was afraid of what day 50 would be. 40 came with a bang, or maybe a pop and fizzle, depending how you looked at it. It started with a president who was just as concerned with foreign policy as he was whether or not his hands would fit in his daughter's gloves comfortably. Then there was the downsizing at the factory he worked at. He dodged the pink slip bullet, but then he saw former co-workers collect their unemployment checks and coast. He wondered if he should have stepped in front of the gun and done the same. As workloads increased, the employees decreased, as did the raises. His marriage was next in line. It hadn't been a fairy tale, but they didn't fight much. Neither of them had a gambling or drug problem. He was content with cruising through life with her towards retirement in the really scary age of 65. Content as long as she was with him. But she wasn't content. He would have seen it if he'd been paying more attention, but you take things for granted the longer you have them. After he'd signed the divorce papers, Carrie thought 40 was done with him. It turned out that 40 had one more trick up its sleeve. Chapter 1. Carrie worked at Glaxcorp, located right off the center of town being Bremerton, North Carolina. Nothing much exciting or important ever happened in Bremerton. They had Carrie Farmer, a Bremerton High prom queen, go on to the semifinals of American Idol, but she claimed to be from Charlotte when they gave her backstory. Then there was David Bertrand, who wrote the bestseller, Stirring the Pot, America's War on Cannabis and Why It Needs to End. But he claimed to be from Asheville for demographic purposes. The one local hero was still around, and he was currently struggling to climb out of the driver's seat of his '95 Oldsmobile Cutlass Sierra. Bruce Barnyard Robinson, a co-worker of Carrie's who'd gone to UNC on a football scholarship. He got drafted in the 7th round by the Cleveland Browns, played a couple snaps on special teams before he was cut, and eventually settled into a factory job back home at Glaxcorp. Bruce gave a wave in Carrie's direction when he emerged from the Olds. His eyes were wide with a mountainous smile beaming as he rubbed his considerable tummy. "Time to eat," he said in a bassy rumble. Carrie nodded and couldn't help but smile back. If only he possessed half the love Bruce had for food, for anything in his own life. Harry's Diner had been their off-and-on breakfast joint for years. It opened at 6, but the coffee was still fresh at 10 after 7 when the third shifters from Glaxcorp showed up. 8 hours of assembling rear-view mirrors and smoke detectors could work up quite a hunger. Carrie approached Bruce at the entry. Bruce stuck out his arm as he held the door. "After you." No, I'd hate to prolong your hunger here," said Carrie. "You might wither up and die." Bruce let out a bellowing laugh. "I got enough stored up to last me another few minutes, I think." They stepped into Harry's and spotted their usual booth. Bruce tipped his head to Nancy, their usual waitress, as they passed. Her face remained stoic as she called over her shoulder. "One barnyard and—" She raised her eyebrows at Carrie. "Oh, what the hell," said Carrie. "And 1-2 egg over easy," she finished. "Guess we're that predictable, huh?" Carrie said to Bruce. "Ain't nothing wrong with it." They slid into one side of their booth across from fellow third shifters, Michelle Barrett and Johnny Bennett. "About time you two showed," Johnny said, and leaned forward so they could smell the coffee on his breath. "You giving out handies in the parking lot again, Barnyard?" Bruce just nodded. Barnyard was his college nickname for obvious reasons that some people would never let him forget. He leaned in closer to Johnny. "Yep, your mother even gave me a tip this time." The table broke out with laughter as Nancy set down 2 more steaming cups of coffee in front of Bruce and Carrie. "You boys ain't gonna be my trouble table today, are you?" She eyed them up and down. "Don't think I won't call Don." This garnered another laugh from the group. Don, the son of Harry, ran things mostly from his office in the back, if you could even call the closet with a desk he hid in an office. He was a small man with a receding hairline and enough gut to know his wardrobe didn't contain any t-shirts from participating in local 5Ks. Johnny raised his hand in surrender. "We'll be good, just don't call Donny boy." He slapped the table. "So how's the world of smoke and mirrors?" Nancy straightened her apron absent-mindedly. "Detectors," corrected Johnny, "and they're pretty much the same as yesterday." Michelle elbowed him in the ribs. "Don't lie, Johnny. Tell them about your record." She ran a hand through her short, spiky hair. "Oh, Jesus," Johnny blushed. "Don't make me go over that." "Well, I'll tell them then," said Michelle. "The boss said old John here was slacking behind the rest of us in production. Said he was holding us all up." Johnny's head was in his hands as he listened to her tell it. "Then they called him in for a meeting, really cut his balls off, and the next day he sets a record for the biggest day ever." "Aw, hey," said Bruce. He and Carrie gave a small round of applause. Johnny lowered his hands, shaking his head. "Probably fucked myself in the ass on that one. Now they're expecting it every day. Damn hands are numb every time I go home." "Beautiful story," said Nancy. "Your food should be out in a bit. I got a seat at my better tipping tables." A few minutes into eating, Johnny was back to ribbing Bruce. "They called it that before you were even born. Ask Harry." "Harry's dead," said Bruce. "Have some respect. But if he were here, he'd tell you they named the barnyard after me." Johnny scoffed. "You were still 2 pigs short of a barnyard when Harry named it." He slammed his hand on the table. "Get Don out here." His command received no reply, though he did manage to knock over the salt shaker. "Watch it there." Carrie tipped it back upright and brushed the salt away. "I'm gonna hit the can," said Michelle as she got up. "Just don't mix up the signs on the doors," said Johnny. She threw back a middle finger with a tattooed A on it, the middle of the word hate, as she walked away. "I'm surprised she doesn't just haul off and kick your ass one day," said Carrie. Johnny tossed his thumb over his shoulder. "Mitch? She knows better than that." Bruce leaned back and rested a large arm on the back of the bench seat. "Call her Mitch to her face when she comes back," he followed with a challenge and a grin. Johnny looked over his shoulder. "I'd rather not." Just after 8, Harry's parking lot was clearing out from the early morning rush. Most patrons were headed to work while Glax Corp's finest third shifters were splitting to head home. They made a train like a funeral procession down Highway 25, until Carrie broke away onto Garrett Road. He was less than half-mile down when he trying to crank his radio to anything but annoying morning DJs. When he looked up and saw the slowest moving possum on earth directly in his path. His foot went instinctively to the brake, knowing if he swerved he'd end up in the ditch or some oncoming traffic. The brakes on his Ford Taurus protested, reminding him by their squealing that they needed to be replaced. He begged them to hold out and silently promised new pads and maybe even new rotors if they prevented him from splattering possum across his grill. When he came to a stop, he couldn't see the animal anymore. The smell of burning rubber was in the air, accompanied by a small cloud of smoke. He craned his neck out the window to see a mother possum with 4 babies attached to her back, emerging, still slow as ever, but unharmed. Carrie was halfway through his sigh of relief when his breath caught in his throat. In the rearview mirror was a red pickup truck coming fast. He gripped the wheel, knowing he had about 2 seconds before impact and no real options. There was another loud squealing, then a man yelling and a thump, more cursing before Carrie dared to even open his eyes. The truck had managed to swerve around him and kept going, raising a thick arm as he did out the window. Carrie threw up his second silent prayer of the morning that the truck wouldn't turn around. It didn't, but this is when Carrie recalled the thumping sound he'd heard. He pulled his car up to the entrance of Bremerton Memorial Gardens and jumped out. The gore was almost more than his stomach could bear. He turned away and had to choke back his 2 eggs and everything else that he'd eaten at Harry's that morning. The mother was straight roadkill, and the babies were scattered like kid stuffed animals around the street. There was nothing he could do. He didn't have it in him to check to see if they were all dead or to put them out of their misery. He could feel his body still shaking from the near collision and now the massacre. Carrie turned and sat on the hood of his car, telling himself how good a cigarette would taste right now, and how he should have given them up. In the end, he'd quit for Laura, but she really didn't have a say anymore. He was searching his brain for the nearest convenience store to pick up a pack when his attention shifted to something wet and plastic under his car. He bent down and pulled out a newspaper, still wrapped in the protective plastic that he'd flattened in haste to get out of the road. He was going to toss it closer to the gate when he recognized the name in print. Dan Dodgeman. It took him a few seconds to figure out why the name was familiar. Bruce. He never shut up about Coach Dodgeman. Coach Dodgeman used to say if you ain't hurtin', you ain't practicing hard enough. Or, Coach Dodgeman says no one ever drowned in sweat. Carrie read the print underneath to confirm his suspicion. Longtime coach of the Bremerton High Bulldogs has passed away today when his SUV was struck by an 18-wheeler. He's survived by his wife Connie and his two children, Marilyn and Dan Jr. Carrie shook his head and held the bag, still wet with morning dew despite the tire print he'd put in it. Bruce would want to know about this. Maybe he already knew, but Carrie didn't think so, or he would have said something at breakfast. Bruce loved the guy like a father. Carrie contemplated calling him on his way home, but decided against it. If it was in the paper, he'd find out. It would probably be on the local news as well. Hopefully Bruce would get a good day's sleep before he heard. No need in ruining that for him now. He tossed the paper, which landed with a wet splat, closer to the gates of the Memorial Gardens and drove home, forgetting about the cigarettes after all. Chapter 2. That evening, Carrie stood in the kitchen, pulling the plastic off his typical bachelor dinner of the microwaved variety. Salisbury steak with a side of mashed potatoes and peas that had been frozen so long they tasted like green dirt. He choked down a couple bites of the peas, trying to get the healthy part out of the way so he could enjoy his nuked steak. He held the flimsy, blazing hot container from the sides to prevent burning his fingers. It sunk in the middle, the cheap plastic threatening to fold in on itself and dump his meal on the linoleum. The TV in the living room showed a family running in a field together. Some commercial for antidepressants, he guessed. But they couldn't get too particular unless they wanted to list the side effects for you, too. He watched the lean, muscular father lift his boy, no more than 5, into the air, both with giant, unreal smiles, while the mother and daughter trailed not far behind, brushing through the flowers. Carrie was relieved he and Laura never had kids. The mess of a divorce and custody battle made him sad for the children he didn't have. And hell, if this perfect family on TV needed antidepressants to make it work, what would his screwed-up family need? Carrie settled into his old brown couch, brought up from the guest room when Laura left and took the nicer gray leather one. His couch still smelled musty, and he told himself he'd do something about it. And he would, maybe tomorrow, the tomorrow when people start their new diet and exercising and whatever else people set out to do on a day that never comes. The drug commercials were over, and the late news at 10 was starting. It didn't take long for them to get to the story Carrie was waiting for, the death of Coach Dodgeman. Only they were calling it breaking news, as if it hadn't been in the paper that morning. Carrie guessed they'd call about anything breaking news to make you pay attention. New details emerge that duck found wandering downtown last week. Turns out he came from a single-parent home. Yes, growing up with about a proper Drake in his life really turned him to a life on the streets. Carrie laughed at his own stupid thought while they played the details of Dan Dodgeman's death. The anchor went on. Struck in an intersection when he was on the way home from football practice. We turned to Mark Lawrence, who was at the scene. The camera showed a man standing at a dark crosswalk holding a microphone. Thank you, Rachel. This was the intersection earlier today where Dan Dodgeman was driving home in his GMC Yukon when he was struck on the driver's side by an 18-wheeler. First responders reported him dead on arrival. Carrie held a chewy bite of steak in his mouth as his eyebrows sunk inward. He looked at the scene on the screen and the matching darkness outside his own window. Then he looked at the time at the bottom right corner. 10:04 p.m. They could have recorded this earlier, he thought, but the red live sign was next to the time on the screen, flashing defiantly at him as if it knew what he was thinking. At that point, Rachel had moved on to a light-hearted story, according to her, of a local deer found wandering downtown. Carrie would have laughed if he wasn't so confused. They'd said earlier today, when talking about the wreck, but how much earlier? The paper he'd seen at 8 that morning was wet with dew, meaning it had been there since the normal time papers went out, 5 or 6 a.m., he assumed, meaning further that it was printed even earlier than that. How would they have had that story already? Had he misread it? You couldn't misread an accident. It would have been one thing if he was in the hospital on life support, but a car wreck? He wondered if he could still find a copy of today's paper. Maybe he'd check on his way to work. Carey finished his meal, chalking up the news story to a misunderstanding on his part, but still would be interested if he could find it in writing. At 10:30, he stood in front of his bathroom mirror, brushing his teeth and staring at his reflection. Something the age 40 hadn't taken from him yet was his hairline, still full, thick, and black with a slight curl. He usually kept it short enough that you could barely see the curl, but now it was bordering on a mini afro. He looked over his shoulder in the mirror, half expecting Laura to be standing there, waiting to brush her teeth, not before work, but before bed. She'd casually run a hand through his hair at first, and then give him a smack on the butt if he still didn't move. It was something he did purposefully most nights. But there was no one over his shoulder, just the old off-white door that needed a touch-up on paint. His face was pale from sleeping away most of the sunshine, and his 5 o'clock shadow had turned into a 10 o'clock shadow. He dragged a hand across his cheek, listening to the scratch of the stubble, and considered a shave. He popped open the cabinet behind the mirror, revealing a chic razor that needed a new blade. His heart rate picked up when he saw a small plastic bottle. It fit in his hand easy, and he rubbed the label longingly. They were pain pills from a minor surgery a little less than a year ago. He wondered how potent they were at this point. Each night for the past month he'd find himself there, just before work, and each night it would still get his heart racing enough to think, am I really going to do it this time? The urge wasn't to take one pill to numb himself for the long night of assembly ahead, but to take all the pills and numb himself indefinitely. He replaced the bottle on the shelf with a shaking hand and put both hands on the sink and shook his head slowly as he stared into the drain. Maybe one night he'd build up the courage. Maybe they'll lose their potency before you grow the balls, a voice in his head said. He shrugged it away and went to get dressed. Carey left for work a few minutes earlier than usual, stopping at a couple different gas stations hoping for a leftover newspaper. He had no luck and was driving up Garrett Road when he saw the Bremerton Memorial Gardens approaching on his right. His headlights lit up the big locked gates as he pulled over. He didn't see the paper from that morning. The patch of blacktop was clear, though he was pretty certain he could still see a dead possum on the side of the road not 10 feet ahead. He didn't stick around to confirm, driving the rest of the way to Glax Corp with the radio turned up loud. Turned out Bruce hadn't seen the news, but they weren't 5 minutes into the shift before someone told him about Coach Dodgman. Carey felt like a wuss for not mentioning it right away to his friend. Instead, he had to hear it secondhand from two men discussing who was going to take over for the head coach. Bruce made it through his shift, but declined a visit to Harry's afterwards. Carey sat across the table from Johnny and Michelle at their usual table, picking at his eggs with no real inclination to put them in his mouth. Something got to you too? Asked Michelle. Carey looked up, realizing she was talking to him, and pursed his lips at her. Just feel bad for the big guy, I guess. I hear you, she said. He's the kind of guy you don't ever want to see sad. She looked to her right and shook her head. Unlike this guy here, cries over every hangnail he gets. Johnny sat up straight to defend himself. Hey now, I was more than a goddamn hangnail. He lifted a bandaged finger out to her. You want to see it again? Damn near took my ring finger off. Please don't, said Carey as Johnny started at the bandage. We're eating. Fine. Johnny brought his hand back to his fork. But it don't look like you're eating much. Just moving it around like a little kid at the dinner table. You know there ain't no dog to feed it under the table to, right? Carey laughed at this, dropped his fork, and pushed his plate to the center of the table. Well, hell, said Johnny. I'll take that bacon off your hands. He reached forward and snatched it up before Carey could protest. After the check came, Carey headed to the bathroom. When he was washing his hands, he spotted a crumpled newspaper in the trash. He'd be damned it was the first name he saw wasn't Coach Dodgman on one of the folded edges. He gave a quick look around to make sure the other stalls were empty, then reached in to pull it out. The door opened with a loud creak and Carrie jumped at the sound, dropping the paper back into the trash. Johnny stood holding the door, giving him a strange look. Jesus, man, I ain't here to look at your dick. What's got you so spooked? He noticed Carrie's eyes instinctively looking into the trash for the paper. You rummaging for treasures in there? Probably have better luck out back in the dumpster. You don't want to know what kind of stuff was left in here. Carrie decided to ask anyway. When did Coach Dodgman die? Huh? Johnny scratched his head and looked longingly at a urinal. You gonna talk about that right now, or can I take a whiz first? Just the time. Do you know what time he died? Johnny's face became more confused. Hell do I look like, a coroner? No, never mind. Forget about it, said Carrie, stepping around him and out of the bathroom. And that is the end of our first session of the Graveyard Gazette. We'll start more with part 2 next week. Follow the playlist that I've created. I'll stick it right here. Thank you.